afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Dionisia Ramos, and I'm the Vice Chair here at the Center for Latin American Studies. We're really pleased to have with us a new faculty member in political science in a year where actually we have about 9 new faculty on this campus who focus on Latin America, so we feel really excited to have Aila with us today. I know it can be a really hectic start to your first year, and so we're grateful that you took the time to share some of your research with us. I'll tell you a little bit about Aila before she gets started with her presentation, and then there will be a brief period for some questions immediately after. So Aila is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. She received her PhD in political science at Stanford. And her research interests include international engagement during and after Civil War conflict and governance by non-state actors. And today, Professor Matanock will be speaking on support for the Colombian military. So thank you all for coming, and please welcome Professor Aila Matanock.
Great, thank you so much for coming. This project is about support for the military in Colombia, and it's a new project. We've just finished this paper, so we could very much use your feedback, your comments, and suggestions at this point. I should note before starting that this material was supported by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and so any views that I express today are my own and not theirs necessarily. Okay, so to give you an overview of what I'm going to do today, in this paper we measure support for the military in Colombia, which is a state's armed apparatus that's sort of active in the counterinsurgency there, a counterinsurgency that's been going on since 1964 when the current leftist groups emerged. And specifically what we've done is we've designed an experiment where we randomize whether people get a direct measure of support for the military or an experimental measure of support for the military. We have a theory based on preference falsification that people will feel both social support and possibly actual fears of social sanctioning and retribution if they diverge from the dominant view in Colombia, which is that the military is pretty widely supported. And we think that this concern should be especially salient in particular regions where individuals are reliant on illegal organizations or activities for their survival. So in regions of guerrilla control or where there's coca cultivation. So basically in these regions and overall, we think that the direct measures should report a pretty high and not very varying rate of support for the military. And then once we introduce the experimental measure, that we should see much lower rates of support reported and that these should vary much more. The evidence for this paper comes from a survey that we conducted in Colombia in May of 2010. It was 1,900 face-to-face interviews. It's a nationally representative sample and then some oversampling in conflict regions. And what we find here, the results that I'll be presenting today suggest that when we measure support for the military directly, we get about 55% saying that they support the military. This is a very sort of hard measure, which I'll discuss later. But that when we measure this experimentally, we see only about 35% saying that they support the military. So this is much lower rate. And this matches our expectations about preference falsification. So today, what I want to do to get to these results is I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, both the broader context and the Colombian context, as well as the theory that we have here. I will then turn to the research design and analysis, and then finally I'll wrap up with the results and some discussion about what they mean and what these should suggest to us going forward. Okay, so there's a big question in social science about how much social support counterinsurgency operations, those conducting counterinsurgency operations, have. And this is one example. This is a 2010 poll which asks in Afghanistan how much support US military troops have there. And what you can see is that there's some variation. It's about 49% here where you have coalition airstrikes in the area. We get up to about 69% where the Taliban's not active and where the local conditions are good. In general, however, there's actually not that much variation, what we would expect. If you put the margins of errors around these, we're actually not seeing a hugely substantial difference in what people report, in how much support people report having for US troops across Afghanistan, despite the fact that we know that there's an ongoing and quite robust insurgency there. Which raises a question. So we think in social science, and there's emerging military doctrine that suggests that this social support is really important for being able to fight effectively. But I'm not sure that we have great measures of how to measure support for the military. This is what my co-author and I are seeking to tackle here. So aside from this counterinsurgency context, we have other reason to believe that people may hold more private preferences about their support for any state actor, especially the regime or the military, that can shift suddenly. So in these counterinsurgency contexts, we call this hearts and minds doctrine. We have this theory about how popular support really matters to these actors. But outside of this, we also see this in the recent work on revolutions, which suggests that one reason why revolutions come so much by surprise is that actually people are holding preferences which they might not reveal when asked directly, but that can collapse suddenly. And so the argument here is that seemingly stable states could potentially show this huge change all of a sudden. What we think is that regimes and militaries in counterinsurgency contexts may actually be vulnerable to overrating and potentially prone to these shifts in revolution about preferences for the military. And so this is the context in which we're gonna look at this. The current measures are basically two. The first is these direct survey questions, which I've just shown you for Afghanistan. These are common across contexts. In Egypt, for example, people were asked about the regime and the military just before the Arab Spring. And even in 2008, there was not one person who said that they had no confidence at all in the military in Egypt, right? So these are, there's reason to believe that these may be over-reporting support. The other is to look at changes in numbers of attacks across contexts, which may work in some cases in very active insurgencies, but they may not work as well in other cases. So we draw inspiration from a particular example where we actually find variation in terms of different types of measures. This is the 1990 Nicaraguan elections. And what we saw there were that there was a series of surveys conducted leading up to the polls, including an ABC poll 10 days before the election that suggested that Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista candidate, was going to win by 16 points. What actually ended up happening was that the opposition candidate, Violeta Chamorro, won, of course, by 14 points. Right, so all the way up until the elections, there's this very different measure of who actually is being widely supported. And almost all of these polls got it wrong, and got it pretty substantially wrong. There's one set of polls that actually gets it right, and those are the ones that are conducted by Chamorro's own organization or the ones that are seen as tied to her. And so in looking at some of these, there's an ingenious experiment run by a couple of social scientists in Managua in 1990 where they gave people pens. They were either black and red pens that said Sandinistas or Daniel for Presidente on the pens, or they were blue and white pens and had the label of the opposition party on them, or they got neutral pens. The only one that actually correctly predicted the results of the election were the ones that had the blue and white opposition logo on them. So this suggests that there may be ways in which we can get individuals, even within one particular moment of time, to more accurately reveal preferences that they may be afraid to express about the regime or its associated militaries in particular countries. So this is our inspiration for the project, and this is what we draw on. Just to give you a little bit of background on the Colombian case, I know many of you are familiar with this, so I won't go into too much detail, but the current civil conflict dates back to 1964, where we first see this emergence of leftist groups, including the FARC. And then we see an emergence of more right-wing paramilitaries, especially in the 1980s. Both become somewhat involved in drug trafficking. And most important for our analysis here, the military over this period of time has become much more professionalized and much stronger over the course of these years. So by the time that we get Plan Colombia in 2000, where we have lots of US aid coming into the country, we have a much more professionalized military. What does stay pretty constant for the military over time is that they tend to be not that involved in politics, especially for a Latin American country. So the military has been given pretty significant autonomy by states ever since General Gustavo Rojas took control in the 1950s, and then the military turned over the country to this national pact between the conservatives and liberals. The military has agreed to keep its hands off of the domestic politics. In exchange, it's gotten a lot of leeway in terms of how it wants to run the counterinsurgency and defense in the country. In the 1990s, when it became clear that this policy was not working so well, we do have an attempt by the Pastrana administration to crack down on this and bring the military more under civilian control. There's some success of this, but the failed negotiations with the FARC in 1999 and then in 2000 and 2001 hurt that effort. And so when Uribe comes into office in 2002, with this huge amount of aid funding from the US, he begins this Plan Colombia, which is supposed to give the military partial autonomy with some civilian control in a way that strikes a deal between the two sides in order to fight the counterinsurgency there. So we can come back and talk more about those details, but one of the most surprising things to both me and my co-author, who's lived in Colombia for a long time, is that we actually haven't seen support for the military bounce around very much in Colombia, and I'll show you some results on that. But we have seen it commit some pretty massive human rights violations that have been outed at various points in time. And so we would expect there to be some variation here. In particular, so lots of these were based on the military's ties to paramilitaries in the earlier years. There was sort of a policy of leftist extermination. But one of the big scandals actually broke just before our survey was taken. In February of 2010, there was a scandal known as falsos positivos, where poor Colombians were essentially taken by the military with promise of work out into the rural regions and shot, and then labeled as guerrilla fighters who they had killed in order to get promotions and the like. So that had broken just before we ran this survey in the field. So we would expect things like that would cause significant jumps in terms of support for the military. In fact, what we found in the data, just looking across polling that asks directly, do you support the military in Colombia, and specifically, how much do you trust the military in Colombia, is often the way that these polling questions are asked. What we find is that Colombia is here with 67%. This is only statistically different from the US and Canada, right, if you're looking at these numbers. So only in the US and Canada do they have more trust in the military than in Colombia. And what we find is that this stays pretty stable across years. So this is 2004 through 2012. And what you can see there is that trust in the military stays above 60%. And if you're looking at these are 95% confidence intervals, so it jumps around very little. There was a scandal that broke in 2007 that linked one of the main military officers to the paramilitaries. We do see slightly lower support in that year, but really these numbers are surprisingly stable to us. The military has been consistently ranked third in trust after the Catholic Church and the president in Colombia. Right, so these are really strikingly high. We'll ask a little bit different, a slightly different question than trust in the military, but I think this is important to have as sort of background theory. It suggests to us that there are two options. One, trust in the military, support for the military could actually just be quite high. Security is improving during Uribe's security plan. So it's possible that people actually are just more supportive. There's also a lot of media coverage of the positive outcomes of this plan, less coverage of these human rights abuses. So it's potentially possible that this is just sort of how people feel about the military. But we think that this widespread promotion of the military, both by the regime and by the media, actually may suggest that there could be something else going on here, which is preference falsification. We think that people may just know that this is sort of the dominant view in the country, that you should report. We would see about 60% support, and that's what we continue to see. We would expect this to especially be true with groups that rely on guerrilla-controlled regions to run coca products, or who actually cultivate coca products in those regions, that they should not really support the military at this high of rates. So we should see variation across different territories. And we haven't seen that in any of these sort of large-scale polls conducted in Colombia. Okay, so based on that background, we decided to turn to this literature on preference falsification. And basically here, we want to suggest that support may be determined by a variety of things, but one of the reasons that people may express support for a particular actor, in this case the Colombian military, may be that they feel social pressure from their peers to report support for the military because lots of other people are doing it, or that they may actually fear retribution if they don't report support for the military. What we've seen in some of this literature are that experiments can better measure certain outcomes, so they can get polls that actually better represent certain behaviors by using experiments. And list experiments are one type of these measures. So just to explain what a list experiment is, what you do for a list experiment is you offer someone a list of 3 things, and you say, how many of these things do you support? Don't tell me which of these you support, just tell me how many of the 3 things. You give that to half of the sample. Then to the other half of the sample, you give them a list of 4 things. And the 4th thing is the item that you want to measure. So in this case, it would be support for the military. And I'll show you the exact phrasing of the question. But basically, the difference in the means between those 2 samples, or 2 subsamples broken down, should actually give you an estimate of support for the military. So we can think of this in the extreme. You would never want to design a sample like this, but let's say your question, everyone in the survey supported all 3 items on the control. So you would have, 3. Everyone would answer 3 when given the control list. If everyone then answered 4 when given this additional item, you would have 100% support, right? The difference in these means would be 1. So you would know that everyone in that sample supported the military because they're all reporting 4 now at this point. If everyone in that treatment sample instead reported 3, you would know that this means 0 support because you're getting exactly the same answer across those 2 groups. There are lots of assumptions built into this about design effects and about balance across the 2 groups that I'll talk a little bit more about and when I show you the specific question that we asked. But in general, what we think is that this should give people an additional level of anonymity. So we're actually not getting them to press all the way up against this ceiling effect where they're answering 4 items. Instead, we're comparing lower levels of means. And so what we think is that in these, they should be more protected. They should feel like their identity is not going to be revealed for reporting, for instance, low levels of support for the military. And we know that list experiments have worked to do this in the US, for example. So lots more people report racism, report drug use, report all sorts of other sort of socially condemned behaviors in the US through list experiments. There are also some that can be verified through behavioral links. So for example, people tend to over-report whether or not they turned out to vote. When you link those with voting records, you can see that when you ask with the list experiment as opposed to a direct question, you can actually get at truer rates of reporting about whether or not you voted, because people don't feel the same pressure to report sort of the dominant view in these surveys. So this is the main idea that our work builds on. Specifically in the Colombian context, what we think should be the case is that individuals should feel a lot of pressure to say that they support the military, that we should see sort of this very stable level of support across contexts for the military, and that there should be a lot of pressure to accept this dominant view. This should be both social pressure as well as potentially this fear of retribution. So especially in certain contexts, which I'll talk about in a minute, people may actually feel this, may actually fear retribution from reporting truer rates. So with these unobtrusive measures, what we're hoping to do is actually lessen the pressure that individuals feel to report sort of this very dominant view. And so our main hypothesis is that under insurgency, direct measures of support for the military we expect should be higher than experimental measures for the military. So this is our main hypothesis. I know I've covered a lot of ground here in terms of both talking about list experiments, which I'll come back to a more concrete example of, and showing you sort of our first main hypothesis. Are there any questions, clarification questions that You want to ask now before I go on? Okay. Okay, great. So I want to add two sub-hypotheses to this. The first is about control and collaboration. So there are particular regions in which the guerrilla groups in particular, especially the FARC, have sort of taken control over these regions, and in which we think that there's a lot of collaboration with these groups, but also in which the, individual citizens receive lots of social support, lots of social services from these groups. So in those contexts, we think that support for the state, including the military, should be much lower, and support for these insurgent groups and for their armed actors should actually be much higher. We think, however, that these may not be reported as much because there may be an especially high fear of retribution in these areas. This is in 2010. The Colombian government was just getting ready to launch a new initiative against regions that were guerrilla controlled. So there was sort of a very real thought that you could potentially be targeted if you sort of outed yourself as being someone who supports an insurgent group rather than the government. The survey, as I mentioned, was run with funding from a Minerva grant through the Department of Defense, and so we had to mention when we gave the survey that this would be used by U.S. universities and U.S. military government agencies. Given the known alliance between the U.S. and Colombia, especially for security purposes under Plan Colombia, we have to believe that this survey could not be thought of, or potentially would not be thought of as truly anonymous. So even though we didn't collect sort of identification measures, markers for any of these individuals, we think that there's pretty strong assumption that this survey is not really anonymous by individuals responding to it. And so we actually kind of use this to our benefit. We sort of wanted to increase the salience of this possibility of retribution. So we explore two sub-hypotheses here. First of all, we identify regions that we believe are guerrilla controlled. And in those regions, we think that this difference between the direct measure and the experimental measure should be even larger. That is, the direct measure should continue to report this sort of very normal level of support, but what we should see is an even lower reported rate of support by those who are living in these particular regions. We expect the same to be true with regions in which there's coca cultivation. So these do overlap to some extent. I can show you the correlation, but in general, we think of these as two different hypotheses for testing. The other sub-hypothesis that we wanted to test, and this one is one that comes out of both the counterinsurgency but also the military literature, is that once one side or the other seems destined for success, or once it's likely that they will succeed, there seems to be a shift in actual preferences towards that group. So regardless of where you fall in terms of your own policy preferences, you would prefer to be on the side of the winner, because when they win, you're going to get better services from them, you're going to get more services from them. And so in the Colombian context, what we expect this to be is the military side. So we expect that once active engagement starts, these illegal organizations, these illegal coca cultivation has been disrupted, that we should actually see people shifting to actually align with the state and with the military in these contexts. And so what we expect to find here is that the negative difference should be very minimal, if at all present, in regions in which the military is actually actively contesting these counterinsurgency operations. And that is because there's a sort of a strong assumption that once the military does actually contest a particular region, it will win that municipality. And that sort of matches up with some data that my co-author has about where the military fights. But basically, once they go into one of these regions, they tend to win that region. Okay, so these are the three sub-hypotheses that we'll be testing in addition to the main hypothesis in these data. There are, of course, other theories about why people support militaries in general. There's a question about collateral damage. Support may go down for the military, for example, if they actually are creating lots of collateral damage. That's pretty hard to measure in these contexts, what is intentional versus what is collateral damage, and how many of these deaths are civilian deaths versus combatant deaths, because this is irregular warfare. Yeah?
I have a quick question about this success hypothesis. This seems super interesting. But my intuition might have been that the indirect measure taps as a sincere preference for against the military, so that the negative difference would be could indeed be bigger in areas where the corn operations are taking place. In other words, you want to falsify your preferences in order to, particularly if the military is going to eventually have success. But what would be struggling a bit with the logic for the smaller negative good?
Yeah, so our thought here is that people's true preferences actually shift in those contexts. I think that is certainly a logical hypothesis that we would see even larger divergence in these regions like we would see in these regions that are controlled by guerrillas. Or where there's coca cultivation. But our thought is that once the military actually does come into these regions, it has such a high likelihood of winning that there actually is a true shift in preferences to just align yourself with the state, since that's sort of the eventuality of what you're going to face in terms of who's going to be providing social services and doing governance there. So you can definitely see that there is a very plausible alternative hypothesis in these conditions, right? But I think, given how much stronger the military is in the FARC at this point, that's why we have this particular hypothesis, and this could look very different in other contexts. So that's a great point and something that we should clarify. Okay, so we look at evidence from this survey that I described. We ran this survey through a Bogota-based firm, the CNC. They conduct face-to-face interviews. We had this sample, which included 45 municipalities in 6 different regions of Colombia. Of the 1,900 Colombians surveyed, 1,300 were for this sort of nationally representative sample that the survey firm uses for all sorts of things. And then we oversampled these 600 individuals in regions that were particularly conflicted so that we could get some sort of variation in these guerrilla-controlled regions, for example, in paramilitary-controlled regions. Overall, these are the breakdown of these subgroups. So 474 individuals received the direct question, which I'll show you in just a minute. 474 received the treatment half of the list experiment, and then 949 received the control half of the list experiment. Okay, so this is the direct question that we asked. This is the exact phrasing, although of course it was in Spanish at the time. So the question reads, some people believe that the Colombian military forces should have more freedom to defend the nation in the way they see fit. Do you think that Colombian military forces should have more freedom to defend the nation in the way that they see fit? So this is a very typical survey question framing, and our answer was a binary response, so yes or no. So we sort of forced people into these 2 choices. After this question, they then got a 5-point response where they could show more variation, but this is sort of the way that we wanted to frame this. And we had to frame this as a binary question in order to match up well with the list experiment. Okay, so I think one thing to note before we go on to the list experiment is this is a very high standard in terms of support for the military, right? We're asking them about giving more autonomy to the military to run counterinsurgency operations in the way that they see fit. We did this for a couple of reasons. The first and most important is that when you ask about support for the military in a survey, it's not really clear what people are responding to. They could be saying everything from, I feel sympathy for an individual member of the military, to I wish the military would carry out a coup against the government, right? So there's sort of a very large scale of variation about what you would mean by support. So we wanted to get a very specific question, and this one has been under debate in Colombia for a long time. Uribe, the president at the time of Colombia, was sort of closely aligned with the military, and he had given them a great deal of freedom, and this was an issue that was under debate. The opposition pushed the military, tried to push the military more out of the government affairs, and Uribe and his supporters would have liked to have seen them even more in the government affairs. So this was a particularly important framing for us. We do think that this should result in slightly lower levels of support expressed than something like how much do you trust the military, which may actually have a higher level of reporting.
Could I
Yes.
ask about that?
Yeah.
It seems a little bit maybe biased because you sort of expect other people believe that they have too much freedom already, but that second half isn't there, and so you have to kind of say, no, I'm a dissenter, or you're being given the official line.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, these are equally valid viewpoints, which one comes
Mm-hmm.
to you.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of literature in the survey question world about how to frame questions like this, and this is generally, pretty widely accepted way to frame this, about just stating the question. Some people do X, and then do you do X, or some people believe X. Do you believe X?
That's the government line, though, so it's already
Right.
kind of the
Yes.
the opinion of those in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is true. So you may actually have, you may be seeing more of an effect because of that here. That's absolutely a possibility. And I think that, the interesting thing to note is that between these two surveys, or between these two methods, what we're trying to get at is sort of a difference here. And so this, you're absolutely right. This may be sort of reinforcing, in a direct question, how much support you should report for the military if you're sort of trying to fall into line with the dominant view. Yep, I think that's a good point.
Some people worry that the Colombian military have too much freedom in their choices
Right.
about defending the nation.
Right. Yes. So we could have tested it the other way, and we could try doing that in future surveys. It's a great idea. In general, we think that our survey should be kind of communicating that point very effectively anyway, because of the disclosures that we had to give at the beginning of the survey that suggests that this is being run by the U.S. military and U.S. military funding, and that's sort of the way the whole survey is framed. But yes, this could be even amplifying that effect. Yep. Okay, so this is the list experiment, the specific list experiment that we ran in Colombia. And so what we have here is, we present this list and we ask, here's a list of 4 or 3 things that some people support and others do not. Please tell me how many of these things you support. The list experiments had not been run in Colombia as far as our survey team could tell before this list experiment, so we really wanted to emphasize, don't tell me which of these items you support, just tell me how many of these items to support, to really get at the fact that they should not be telling us which particular one of these items. The choice of which control items you have on a list experiment is actually very important because there are certain design effects that you want to avoid. And so we chose these items from current surveys in Colombia, mostly run by La POP, that had gotten that had been significantly in the news, had gotten some discussion or debate around them, but that also had negative correlation with each other. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But basically, you don't want anyone to be pushing sort of the high end of the scale. You don't want people to be reporting that they support all 3 items. So you want some negative correlation between these different items. And then for the treatment half of the group, we added this item. And so this is the same phrasing as the item for the direct question. And so now you're assessing out of these 4 items, how many of those you support. So half of the sample gets this question, the other half of the sample gets this question, and we're comparing means across them. Okay, so the independent variables were collected at the municipal level. These are the ones that we'll be focusing on today. There are some other ones that I can also show you at the end if you're interested. But basically, we're interested in state control versus guerrilla control, and we also have this 3rd category coded as paramilitary control. So who controls the municipality in which you live in? Then we have military operations. Is the military actively conducting military operations in the municipality in which you live in? Finally, is there coca cultivated in the municipality in which you're living? We've done other variations about this, about having to meet some threshold or how much coca is cultivated. It doesn't change the results. So here, this is just a dummy indicator that that there is coca cultivation in the municipality. Okay, so the analysis that I'm going to show you is actually really simple. What we're doing is we're basically running a comparison of means within the list experiment to say how many of these people supported the 4th item, what's the percentage of this population that supports military, and then we're comparing means across the direct question and the experimental question. So we want to say within that direct question, what percentage of people are saying they support the military, and then within this experimental question, what percentage of people are saying that they support the military. We've explored many different options about how to model this, and we can decrease our confidence intervals. We can talk a little bit more about this, but basically these are kind of hard tests for our data because they do have among the widest confidence intervals of the different types of analysis we would use. There There are a couple of assumptions that we have to make sure are met before we would use a list experiment. The first is that we need balance between the control and the treatment groups here. And so we added a bunch of different variables. These are just the ones that I'm showing here, but we actually have a whole barrage of these collected from the survey. And then compared the means between the two groups. And basically, you wouldn't want the mean here to be much higher than the mean here, because that actually could be influencing your results as to why you would get many more people answering. We do have a significant difference in gender, and so basically what this is suggesting is that we have more women in the treatment group than we did in the control group, which happens sometimes with randomization. And so what we do in the results that you'll see is we weight the data for gender. There are other ways that you could deal with this as well, which we've tried, and I'm happy to talk more about that. In general, the balance looks okay, and then the other factors you have to be worried about are floor and ceiling effects. So as I mentioned, you wouldn't want everyone to be saying that they support all three of the control items, for example, because then saying that you support the military would reveal whether you specifically report the military. So you sort of want to end up with a mean that's right in the middle. Likewise, if you go all the way to the floor where people are saying I support 0 of these items, you'll again get people revealing their own preferences about the military. So it's very important to keep these sort of in the middle. And our data actually pass a lot of different tests that look at whether you're getting a floor or ceiling effect here. And again, I can come back and talk about that. The other assumption that this makes is when you add the fourth item, the FARC, you aren't somehow getting people to respond differently to the first 3 items. So that's a pretty strong assumption that this experiment makes. And the data don't seem to be showing that here. We have done some other list experiments in which we do see systematic differences once you add in the fourth item, and I'm happy to talk more about those and why we don't think that that's a concern here. Okay, so this is the main result. In this slide, what we're looking at is when we measure directly, what is the level of support for the military, and this is a 95% confidence interval placed around that. And then when we measure through the list, what's the reported rate of support that we get for the military, and here's the confidence interval around this. Again, as I mentioned, this is about 55% support this here and about 35% support this here, right? The confidence intervals don't overlap, so we actually think that there is significant difference between these two measures in terms of the reported rate of support. One thing you might be thinking is, well, maybe people just report lower rates of support in general in list experiments, perhaps in Colombia because they've forgotten items at the beginning of the list, or they have some other motivation for doing that. We don't find that to be the case because we look at other institutions using list experiments as well. So this is support for the PIN. It's a political party that was active in the 2010 election campaign that was tied to the paramilitaries. It's a legal organization, so we wouldn't necessarily expect that there's sort of any social pressure regarding this organization. What we find is a slightly higher mean of support reported in the experimental versus the direct measures. But again, these confidence intervals do overlap quite highly, so we actually can't say that there's any difference between these two measures. Right? But this should give us gives us some more confidence that perhaps this isn't just a relic of the measure that we're using, and there's actually something going on here with the military. Okay, so then we want to turn to these different sub-hypotheses that we wanted to test. So in this one, what we're looking at is different areas of control. So here we have the state control, and what we see here is that the results look very similar to when we have the overall chart. And this is not very surprising. The state-controlled regions are the majority of the Colombian region, so I mean, this is composing most of the data that you saw in the first plot anyway. When you look at paramilitary-controlled regions, you do see a slightly lower mean of support reported experimentally than directly, but the confidence intervals overlap here, so we don't think this is not a significant difference that we're seeing here. It's when you come over to this guerrilla-controlled regions where you really see a big difference. So in the guerrilla-controlled regions, when measured experimentally, only 6.3% of people are reporting support for the military. When you look at just the average measure, 58% are measuring this. So you have an over 40% difference, over 50% difference in the reported rates of support using these two different measures in measuring directly versus measuring experimentally within the guerrilla-controlled regions. And this is what our theory predicts based on preference falsification. The same occurs when you have coca regions. So these are municipalities in which there's coca cultivation versus these are municipalities in which there isn't coca cultivation. And again, you are seeing a statistically significant difference here, and the mean is much lower here than here. You are also seeing a statistically significant difference here, but again, this is not as low as what we're seeing over here. Okay, so then finally we turn to these operations. So these are regions in which the military conducts operations, municipalities in which the military conducts operations, just prior to our survey. And what you see is that this side is where there are no operations. So here you have the direct measure and here you have the experimental measure. There are no military operations in these regions. So these could be either guerrilla controlled, state controlled, or paramilitary controlled, but they are not actively contested by the military. And over here what you have are actively contested regions. And what you see is that these means are converging to some extent. This confidence interval is much wider because we don't have that many places in our survey that have operations getting the experimental treatment. So potentially if you close down both of these confidence intervals a lot, you may get a slight difference. But again, what seems to be happening to us here is that there's sort of a convergence between the two. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly, and then I'll wrap up and turn it over for questions. But we also look at a set of predictors. So what actually does predict support for the military, especially on an individual level? And so we're using measures here on the individual level from our survey. And what we find is that party affiliation, so that's being affiliated with Uribe's right-wing party, is positively associated with supporting the military, as is gender. Gender is negatively associated, so men are more likely to support the military than women are. These are sort of not at all surprising findings based on what we know. What is a little bit more interesting is that these two variables, being a victim of violence and education, are negatively correlated and statistically significant, but only in the direct measure. So when we measure experimentally, we actually don't see these results popping out. And education in particular has absolutely no effect in these results, which is interesting to us because it may be that people who are of lower education may be less likely to report that they don't like the military as much, but when given these experimental questions, are actually equally likely as more educated voters or more educated poll recipients here.
So in the experimental regression, your outcome variable is not whether they support the military, but whether they're supporting more of those items?
Yes. So the way in which we run the regression, if you're interested, is that we actually have an interaction term for each of these that interacts it with the treatment effect. So that's the way you analyze these predictors within that data. Yeah. Okay, so we think that this is pretty interesting because not only are we finding that the reported rate of support differs, which is sort of our main claim here, but that also the predictors may differ. And so this would be a reason why using the experimental measures may be more important, not just because you'll see a lower rate of support, but because you may actually see different populations supporting the military more or less. Okay, so I'll just, yes?
Skipped over urban.
Oh yes, and so people who are in urban regions are actually less likely to support the military as well with the experimental measure. And we don't have any sort of strong theoretical explanation of that, but it is an interesting finding that doesn't come up as at all significant in the direct regressions, just in the experimental ones. Some food for thought. Okay, so the comparisons here, what I hope we've shown you is that there is a statistically significant difference across these different measures, that the experimental measures tend to be much lower than the direct measures, that we see this especially in regions with guerrilla group control and coca cultivation. They're not as apparent in regions in which the military is active. And so we think that this paper actually has a lot of implications, especially for social scientists in terms of how we measure support for the military, how we might measure support for authoritarian regimes, for example. There may be a lot of pressure in these environments to report higher rates of support, but also to report higher rates among particular different populations in those countries. And so we think that these unobtrusive or less obtrusive measures may actually reveal different levels, but also different predictors for this support. Okay, and with that, I'd very much like to take your questions and comments. Yeah. FARC at this point in time. And so basically the idea that what we think here is that the fear of retribution operates especially for the military. And so it's possible that if you report low rates of support for the military, you might get some sort of sanction from the guerrillas. But in general, if they're in control of these regions, they probably have a pretty good feeling of this anyway. These surveys are expected to be linked with the government, but not necessarily with those rebel groups. And so the fear of retribution should work especially strongly for the government in these contexts, according to our theory. There are cases in which if you thought that the rebel groups were particularly strong, or you thought that they might end up with the results of this survey, for example, that the anonymity would be broken for the rebel groups, that they would be able to figure out who was saying that they didn't support these regions, that would actually work in the opposite direction depending on the context.
It seems one of the implications, though, that you seem unwilling to kind of say is that in rebel-controlled groups there is support for the rebel groups.
Oh yes. Oh no. This paper is about support for the military. I mean, the assumption driving this is that there is support. There's at least what we know from this is that there's lower levels of support, or what we think from this is there's lower levels of support for the military. Our assumption is that there are also higher levels of support for the opposition. And that's actually, we've tried to measure support for armed actors in Colombia, and that's even more difficult for a variety of reasons. It's illegal, first of all, to report support for the FARC. So that's actually been one of the biggest hurdles, and that's sort of where we broke a list experiment, in that people just started answering 0 once you introduce the FARC to a list. And so that's not unexpected, and that's been reported in other contexts on list experiments, but it hasn't really been systematically analyzed. So that's something that we're thinking about. So it's harder to get at that side, but that is sort of the assumption about when people are reporting lower support for the military, there is sort of a higher support for something else. And our guess is that in these regions it probably is the FARC, for example, if they're providing social services. Yeah.
One of the questions I had was, what role does the perceived effectiveness of the military play in determining support? Because I imagine that these differences between the direct and indirect measures might be even greater in a place like Mexico, where I think the evaluations of the effectiveness of the military in ensuring public security, the indirect measures would probably be much lower than the direct measures that you had from America's barometer, which were quite high, especially considering just, I just feel like in general the military has been much less effective in Mexico than in Colombia, providing domestic security, but I don't know if you...
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely a testable hypothesis. We've run some list experiments in Mexico, but not on this particular question. Our theory would suggest that if the military were much less effective, or there was sort of much less dominant view about how much support should be reported from the military, or sort of is on average reported for the military, you may see much lower rates reported within the direct question even. So you may either get less variation from the experimental measure, or depending on the particular context, you actually could see the reverse. The context is really important in terms of what people's assumptions are, both about what's socially desirable and where the potential fear of retribution should come from. So I think that's absolutely a plausible hypothesis that you could test across contexts. It'd be really interesting. Yeah.
What is the reason they want support one or another? That's what we have to ask.
Yes, so
Because
we don't,
we don't support the guerrillas because we would like to guerrillas or the military, because there have to be other reasons more deep than ideological things.
Well, so our theory supposes that some of this support is based on who can best protect my interests, who can best protect me. And so there's actually a lot, in terms of the theory backing this argument, there's a lot of exploration beyond just ideology, what might each side be doing for individuals in these conflicts. But that's a great question. This particular paper doesn't really get at as much why people would support the military or the armed actors in a particular context. Yeah.
What I haven't read your study, but what about not everybody wants to answer a questionnaire, or they might halfway answer it, and what were the incentives to get people to answer, and how many were thrown out?
Yeah, so there were no monetary incentives for the survey. We didn't pay people to take the survey in this context. We actually find pretty high rates of response in face-to-face interviews. In general, across contexts, face-to-face surveys tend to get better response rates often than telephone surveys, for example. But that is, of course, a concern that we may be somehow getting a particularly biased set of people who won't respond, who will just say, no, thank you, I won't take the survey. And so that is a concern. I don't actually, off the top of my head, I can't tell you how many people turned down when they were sampled, actually declined to take the survey here, but I could find out those numbers for you.
This is just done household to household?
Yes, yeah. So the sampling was, there's a random start, and then there's a jump procedure for, so like every 5th household, I believe, in some of the rural areas. And so if the person identified refuses to take the survey, they'll go on to the next one. But that's actually, it's quite low. Those rates are quite low in Colombia. People tend to be willing to take those surveys if they're home, and our survey firm does follow up and go back if they're not home. So they have to actually decline to take the survey in order to get sampled out of this, or not be home for 3 visits, which is really unusual because they visit at different times of day and things like that. So the response rates are generally pretty good. So I think we don't need to be as concerned about that, I think, here in this context. Yeah.
Have you checked your results against voting behavior to see if the salience works out with your preferences?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. My co-author has a book manuscript actually about voting in Colombia and how that switches based on switches in control of different regions, and there is evidence that these do switch, the regions switch when control switches. So, for example, regions that become FARC controlled will go for leftist parties. In terms of matching up these data, the incumbent, so it was not actually an incumbent running in these elections, right? Uribe is not running, but his hand-picked successor is running in these elections. So the incumbent effect is so strong here that I'm not sure that we would have enough variation to really, given our small sample size, to really get at the behavioral measure. But that is where we're going with future work, is to try to link these up to behavioral measures, either in terms of voting or other measures of support for groups, like providing them with aid or
it makes sense to look at more local measures of people, mayors or state governors, since they aren't militarily involved.
Yeah, no. So that's potentially one way that we could induce a little bit more variation here. But again, this sample size is so small, to see variation in voting at these levels would be really hard, because we again can't tie these individuals to like a voting record, right? So it would be samples of the municipality. But no, it's a great suggestion.
So it's just a brief comment on
There are 2 more behind you, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Just on the voting behavior, I mean, in paramilitary regions, often there's only one candidate. So, voting behavior isn't maybe all that telling.
Right. And I think given the incumbent advantage, there are also lots of regions that sort of only have the Uribe candidate running in these. So that would eliminate a lot of our variation. Yeah. Do you have a question, Andrew?
Yeah, I do have one. Can you flip back? I just have a small methodological question. Can you flip back to the slide where you have a confidence interval that goes below 0?
This one? Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Estimated proportion of support. Yes. So if my belief is that if the null hypothesis is nobody supports the military, and we get your estimate, I can't see what your estimate is from here, but and it's anywhere above 0, then we should reject that null. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So what you're asking about is on the far right-hand side of this slide.
It's actually, so even if I think very close to 0, not necessarily 0, but very close to 0, support the military, we're going to reject that if we get anything far above 0. So your confidence intervals, I think they should be, they shouldn't be equally on both sides of the mean.
Yes, in theory they shouldn't. So in actuality, we can get negative reports here if the mean comes down within
I
this
see.
group as well, right?
Okay.
So, but we should not believe that negative number in this context. If we got a lot of negative numbers, that actually could be troubling about our survey, because it might suggest that people are changing their views about the control items when we're adding in the treatment item. And so that's actually what we get when we run the FARC example. So we actually see lots of negative. But this is so small, and actually if you run like a more sophisticated model on this, that confidence interval tightens up to 0 and above. So
Okay.
yeah.
I think if you sort of went back and did it all by permutation inference and started like nobody, and then worked your way all the way up, you could just do hypothesis test for like some very small intervals all the way up and get 95% confidence interval. That would be entirely above 0.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and I think that we could close down our confidence intervals in a variety of different ways as well. You know, even beyond, even in simpler ways than doing that. But this is sort of, I think, a very hard test, perhaps. You know, that's a great suggestion. Yeah.
It's wonderful to see these days, as opposed to 10 or 20 years ago, how social scientists can do very effective surveys and have this huge repertoire of surveys that are on the table for this kind of larger comparison. And I wonder how much of these data enter into the discourse of Colombian politics, because of course a couple of weeks ago, you know, the newspaper would say, you know, the approval rating for the U.S. House of Representatives as an institution has now dipped even further below 10%. And so these data are on the table in terms of public political discourse. Does that, when there's a new world values or Latino barometer survey, are there newspaper headlines saying, you know, military holding steady at 2/3 approval, or?
Yes, yeah, actually, so the results that I showed you earlier that show about 67% support, those actually are pretty widely reported by the media. That's kind of a big deal when that survey is conducted in Colombia every 2 years. And so those results are out there in the public discourse. And there's a lot of discussion about how well the military is doing, how well the regime is doing. So occasionally, you know, journalists actually go to these data and say, yes, in fact, we know that 67% of people trust the military. But we have not. We're hoping to sort of introduce these results into the policy sphere in Colombia as well. Once we have the paper pinned down and published. And Miguel, my co-author, is at Los Andes University down there, which it has very good relations in terms of doing that. So we're hoping that this may actually have some publicity there, because the polls are known and are reported on. And we think there are ways in which they may not be completely accurate or may not be telling the whole story. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
When you define state control, what are you looking at? And I ask because I just can't run it. I understand you take military as armed forces, so Army, Navy, and Air Force. But the police has kind of a weird effect, because they are in charge of local security. They are not well thought of. So when you say state control, do you include police control, or just for?
Yes, so those are two. I think that actually separates out into two very good questions. One is that we are asking about the military here, and the Colombian National Police, of course, also run a lot of the counterinsurgency operations alongside of them. It's a really different story than what we see in Mexico, for example, where there's much more presence of local police than what we see in Colombia, where there is this sort of national unified police force. The national police actually do pretty well in these surveys as well. So we didn't specifically ask about them in this measure. We asked about the military because we think that this applies across contexts. In terms of what you're looking at here for state control versus paramilitary control versus guerrilla control, these are actually measures that my co-author Miguel developed in his work when he was looking at voting behavior. And what we're looking at there are trajectories of violence. So basically we think that using different patterns of violence in different regions can tell us whether or not those regions were ever contested, and then whether they ended up in guerrilla, paramilitary, or state control. So state control regions here would be simply regions that don't have a sustained presence of paramilitaries or guerrillas moving into them within this period. So this one's measured over 2002 through 2009, and we go all the way back to 97 to sort of look at was there a trajectory in terms of movement, getting a guerrilla group or getting a paramilitary group into these regions. So anything that's state control is sort of the excluded category here. So it's anywhere in which there isn't clear evidence that there's a paramilitary group or a guerrilla group in charge of that region.
So just to be clear, one of your assumptions is that police presence does not affect the favoritism of military?
That is not an assumption of this study. We're not measuring support for the police. In fact, the police don't enter into this study at all. There is potentially people could be thinking military and police and could be aligning them in their heads, so they could be reporting reports of support for the police as well as the military when they're asked these questions. Or it could show up in that if people have had a particularly bad experience with the national police, for example, they might have lower rates of support for the military as well if they sort of conflate the two organizations. But the national police are simply not under observation here, so they're not included in the questions. Yeah.
Probably to get off the subject entirely, is there any testing of how people feel about decriminalization of coca?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that there have been some studies, some polls taken in Colombia. There's actually on the off-cycle years. So La Pop has this big study that asks about trust in the military, and they run it every other year. And on the off years, they run a whole bunch of other experimental questions that allow people to ask about all kinds of things. And my guess would be that it would have just been asked in that. So that just was fielded last month. But I don't know what the results are. But maybe they'll be reported.
There are new questions that come up, and this is a new question that's come up.
Yeah.
Forcefully recently.
Yeah, and so that's what they try and do with these off cycles, is to get some of these new questions and see if they should be asking them on the overall barrage. So maybe in the future they also will be asking these across contexts. But I haven't seen the data on that.
And a question that would certainly merit a list experiment.
Yes, right. Yes, that's definitely true. These are the sorts of things that we've actually looked at in Mexico through list experiments. Do you own a gun, since that's illegal, or mostly illegal in these contexts? It's really hard to get licensed for a gun in Mexico. Do you support the legalization of different kinds of drugs in Mexico? So we have started doing a little bit of surveying there, and list experiments may help get higher.
The politicians in Mexico are coming up with this idea, but has any politician in Colombia spoke out for this?
Yeah, I think throughout Latin America there's been some discussion about this, but again, I haven't seen any polling on this in particular in Colombia. I would guess that it exists, but I don't know.
I just want to go back to the voting and thinking about other behavioral measures that this might connect to, and whether you think the direct measures or indirect measures would be more relevant to behavioral outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so our hypothesis, which is a hypothesis at this point, would be that the indirect measures should correlate better with certain types of behavior. And basically we think that those should be things like even joining an armed group. One of our potential plans for future study is to look in the Philippines, where we have really good data about different members of the military who have come in either as rebels or through the military itself, so the military integrated rebels into the actual military. And so then to ask and list experiments about support for the state there, and then try and measure outcomes in terms of how effective those different battalions are, right, in terms of combating insurgency there. That would be our ideal plan in terms of testing this. Whether or not that would ever make it into the field, I think, is a much bigger question. So we've thought a lot about these outcomes sort of on the more military side. The other one that we've thought of in Colombia, which is harder to get at, is tips. So whether or not individuals might be tipping off the police. And we haven't found anywhere to get good data on that. But that would be sort of another measure that we would really like to see aside from the voting context. So. All right, I'm getting the signal that it is time, so thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate your comments.